Okay, good evening, everybody, and I'm really happy to welcome all of you to the Badaro talks. And this time we have a Nordic friend from Norway, Dr. Idun Hauge, who is a fellow in the American Druze Foundation and also postdoctoral associate at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. And actually we are having this Badaro talks in collaboration with Georgetown University, so we are having some participants across the ocean and hopefully also some members of the American Druze community, not only students. So please, I don't have to introduce your topic because you are the expert, I'm not. So please take the floor.
Thank you. All right. So thank you all for being here tonight, whether here in person or online. So today I'm presenting a lecture entitled From Druze Unicorn Horns to a National Headdress, the historical trajectory of the Tantur as a symbol specifically. And then the year here is 1800 to 2000. It is not the time of day we're doing the lecture. There was some misunderstanding there, which was funny. So this research comes partly out of my dissertation research, something that I defended almost 2 years ago now. But as a Druze fellow, I've also added to this research, which has been very exciting. Little shout out to American University of Beirut. They have digitized several Lebanese newspapers. They are searchable now in French, but also Arabic, which is incredible. You used to have to go through every single page of the newspaper every single day. And so it's been a game changer. So very thankful for that. So maybe you came to this talk knowing what a Tantur was, and maybe you didn't. So a Tantur or Tartur, both are correct, but Tantur is the dominant pronunciation and spelling of the term, is what you see here on the screen. So the Tantur is a conical headdress made out of metal. Specifically copper, silver, or gold. And this was a headdress worn by women in Mount Lebanon historically. So this is the kind of physical characteristics of the headdress. I brought the kind of souvenir tourist version. It looks something like this, a little bit more Disneyfied these days. It's not how it looked historically. You can pass it around if you want, but this is what it looked like historically. When it comes to the meaning of the headdress, it's a little bit trickier. Nice. So first of all, meaning changes over time. So we're actually talking about quite a long history in terms of the use of the Tantur. And so the meaning, the embellishment, for example, is going to change a little bit throughout time. When historians of dress talk about what it means to wear something, whether clothing or accessories, of course they consider the use of a particular type of clothing. For example, if it's very cold, right, you might want to wear something that helps against that. But they talk about clothing also as communicating certain messages to people in your own community. So, for example, if you wore a Tantur, and you saw people within your same community, they would immediately understand what the message of wearing that was. If you present it in front of someone not from your own society, they're not legible in that culture, right? The Tantur is not legible to them. So within the kind of culture of Mount Lebanon, the specific meaning here boils down to a few things. So first of all, if you wore the Tantur, you signal to the rest of the community in Mount Lebanon that you were a married woman, specifically. So if you were unmarried, you would not wear this headdress. Another thing that you signaled to other people was your socioeconomic status. So I mentioned before that it could be made out of copper, silver, or gold, right? If you had a gold version, if it was highly embellished, if it had precious stones, gold coins, etc., you would signal to other people that you were quite wealthy, right? Coupled with the socioeconomic status is the third kind of function of the Tantur, which is actually a dowry. So you might know what a dowry is, maher in Arabic. This is the bride wealth given to the bride, which is hers to keep, right? It's not something you can take away from women. The importance here is as economic stability, a source of economic stability. If something happens to your husband, he divorces you, he dies, there are hard times, this is wealth that you can use in order to secure yourself financially. So this is a very important usage of the Tantur that is kind of lost in the discourse today, and also, honestly, in the 19th century and 20th century. But it's actually a kind of primary function of the headdress. In addition, we know that it was worn by both Maronite women and Druze women of Mount Lebanon. This is something that we can say with certainty, but the problem with something like the Tantur is that we don't have as many sources as we'd like. This is very common for a headdress or any kind of clothing. For example, it's very difficult to know when it first became part of the culture in Mount Lebanon and where exactly it came from. So there are different theories about that. One theory is that it originated in Mount Lebanon. One theory, actually, is that it came from Europe. You might have heard of a hennin before, maybe not. If you look at the screen here, you probably know it in like the Disney version. In the European like Disney imagination, medieval people in Europe wore hats like this. They didn't. They looked a little bit more like this. You'll notice it's quite similar to the Tantur. It's a conical shape. The veil also is attached. The Tantur, as you can see, also has a veil attached to it. So it's quite similar. The problem here is that there are a lot of disagreeing opinions about where exactly this came from and in what direction this influence went. So the conclusion as of right now that I have seen in the scholarship is that the influence probably went from Mount Lebanon to Europe. The reason for that being that in Europe, one of the nicknames of the hennin, so the European piece, was the Syrian bonnet. So likely it originated here before Europe. But we also don't know if maybe it came with the Mongolian invasion, maybe it came from another place in Arabia. There are similar headdresses, actually, other places in the Middle East. So it's always difficult to know. But this talk today is not really concerned with the kind of living culture of the Tantur. So I differentiate in my talk between what I've described now, which is a part of living culture, right? As a woman wearing this, you're wearing it every day. You're communicating something to people in your in-group, right? Whereas what I'm really talking about today, which is the symbol of the Tantur. How did people talk about it? What meanings did it come to have for people who didn't wear it, right? So the first group of people that start to really write a lot about the Tantur in my talk here today is Western travelers. So there's actually a lot of scholarship on Western travelers. These are very kind of standardized accounts. They follow many of the same tropes. In particular, many of you have heard of Edward Said, his book Orientalism, right? These accounts fall under what you might call Orientalist travel literature. So there are several tropes that you see again and again and again in these accounts, including the ones that talk about the Tantur, that you recognize from Edward Said works or other people who have built on his work. So for this talk, I consulted travel literature and also other Orientalist literature from the 19th century in English, French, but also Spanish and Italian. They all say very similar things about the Tantur. And in particular, they treat the Tantur as something that only Druze women wore. So there are some reasons for this. Historically, this was shared. So we know that both Druze and Maronite women wore the Tantur historically. But in the 1840s, it declines in the Maronite community. The current kind of theory about this, what I've read the most by scholars, not non-scholars, is that this has to do with sectarian conflict in the mountain in the 1840s. So the account that you see in the art historical scholarship is that because of sectarian violence, there was an effort by, on behalf of the Maronite Church to differentiate visually Maronite women from Druze women. So it was then banned for Maronite women to wear, whereas Druze women still wore it, at least some. It's difficult to tell for us when it dies out as a living social object also, because the accounts really vary quite a lot. So there's this kind of fascination with the Druze in this kind of literature, especially British accounts talk about the Druze community of Mount Lebanon a lot. And so the fascination with the Tantur also forms part of this larger focus on the Druze as this kind of example of a people imagined as kind of warlike, strong, kind of equivalents of what was called the noble savage, right? It's a romantic view, but it is a condescending one, right? It is not a very respectful one. So the accounts here about the Tantur follow the same tropes as other Orientalist literature. So for example, the idea that the Middle East was stuck in the past, right? That it never changed throughout time, right? That it is a timeless society where you could learn about the Bible through seeing people in the 19th century and look at their customs, right? So any historian would tell you that that is impossible, right? There is, by necessity, always change over time. And the 19th century is a period of rapid modernization also in the Ottoman Empire. So there are massive changes visually also in places like Beirut in the 19th century. And so these are tropes that you see in these accounts. In addition, you have this trope of the kind of oppression of Middle Eastern women by Islam as an actor, as if it were kind of like a person. And also Muslim men as representative of Islamic culture. So this is also something that is, refuted by historians, also in gender studies, I would add, like in feminist Islamic studies. And this is something that you see in these sources. The portrayal of women is also very similar as passive victims, right? Not having a voice. You don't hear the voices of women in this kind of literature, right? They are kind of objects to be pitied. So this repeats in these sources. So let's take a look at what the Tantur particularly symbolized in this kind of literature after my first argument of the day. So my first argument of the lecture is that when the Tantur becomes recorded, so it becomes a fascination in these sources, is actually precisely when it's not used anymore. So it's not really reflective of the social use because there's this sense in Orientalist writing of colonial nostalgia or a belatedness, Ali Bahtad calls it. Meaning that with the kind of onslaught of modernization, the imagined timeless culture, history, etc., is being lost. And so there's this need by Orientalist travelers to, quote unquote, record culture that is going to be lost. And so this is reflective of this particular moment. So the first symbol, really, that the Tantur evokes in this kind of literature is as a symbol of the Orient's otherness, right? The exoticness of the Middle East. So if you read Edward Said, other scholars who work on Orientalism, they tell you that Orientalist literature tells you maybe more about the people writing the literature than the people they are writing about, right? In order to create the self, you create an other. And so in these accounts, the Tantur usually stands out as something weird or bizarre to these travelers. So here, for example, we have the earliest account I've seen. This is from 1836, where the author calls it an extraordinary ornament and a horn of a unicorn. So this is part of the title in the talk today. Horn is repeated quite a lot in these sources, and also horn of a unicorn is not unique to this particular source, right? To call something a horn of a unicorn, right, is not, let's say, a very serious kind of treatment of a headdress, right? It's seen as kind of bizarre and childlike. Here we have an Italian source calling it the most bizarre adornment, a Spanish one calling it a type of ridiculous horn, right? And so there's a kind of sense of not understanding why someone would wear it, even as they describe why one would wear it. So a symbol of the otherness of the quote-unquote Orient. But the second symbol is much more specific, as symbolic of the kind of imagined Oriental oppression of women. And you see this in the accounts where often they're quite excited to see the Tantur, but they also see it as having violent connotations or very negative connotations. So for example, one of our authors here, who may not ever have been to Lebanon, this is a novel actually, it's not a travel account, she calls the appearance of female Druze grotesque and ghost-like. Here you have another account, this time Spanish, saying that the Tantur in particular gives women an air of torment and violence. And then another account here, this time American. She says, one refuses to imagine the condition of the woman's head and the torture she must endure, right? Indicating she probably did imagine it. But here, what's kind of shared in these depictions is kind of the imagined violence of the Tantur, right? It's at once something very attractive that they're very interested in, but also something they see as very negative. The visual culture also reflects this. So if you look at this, this is a part of a French costume book from the 1870s. You have one woman wearing the Tantur in the picture. And if you look at even her position in the illustration here, she's much further behind than everyone else, right? She's not really fully part of the illustration. And she's also much more hidden. And this is due to the Tantur, right? So this kind of air of violence and oppression is also part of the visual representations of the headdress. Here you have some more of those. There's one particular trope that's repeated quite often in these depictions, which is the notion that women could never remove the Tantur, right? That not even while bathing, etc., right? Not even if you were sick. So here we have the same account as the first one, calling it a most inconvenient nightcap, for one would suppose for any lady, meaning you would wear it while sleeping. The next one here, the ladies who would wear the Tantur should not remove it under any circumstance, even in sickness. Right? And the next one here, some of them are said to sleep with their horns on at night. This is something that's repeated. There is disagreement about when you would remove it, if ever. Some say never, not even on your deathbed, right? And it might be tempting when you have something repeated in these accounts to say this is evidence that this is part of the social practice, right? But before we do that, I want to draw your attention to the fact that these are very unreliable narrators. So even when you look at the Tantur as a case study, there is wide disagreement about all kinds of things, about something very, very specific. So for example, there's disagreement in these sources about why women wear it. So for example, is it to display wealth, right? Dowry is almost never mentioned. I've seen it one time in all of these accounts, which is kind of the main usage actually historically. Out of extreme attachment and zeal is often mentioned, right? The women are so irrationally attached to the Tantur that they would never remove it, right? Is it to show marital status? Is it to show that you're married? Or is it to show that you're unmarried? One account, for example, said that it was to court men, right? But it's a symbol of being married, right? And so that wouldn't make much sense to wear something indicating that you're married before you're married in order to get married, right? So a lot of different opinions there. When did it go out of fashion? Very different accounts there. In the 1840s, for maybe just Maronite women, maybe both Maronite and Druze, disagreements. Whether it was in the late 19th century for both communities or just the Druze, disagreements there. Some accounts don't mention it. They kind of talk about it, even in the later period, as something that all women in Mount Lebanon wear currently, right? There's no recognition of it being kind of a dying social habit. There's also disagreement on the origin, which is also true among scholars, by the way, so that part is a little fair. Does it come from the Henin? Is it the other way around? Is it from Mount Lebanon? Is it from another part of Arabia, another part in Arabia? Is it from biblical times, for example? Remember that these travelers think of themselves as going on a Holy Land tour, which means they are actually quoting the Bible quite extensively in these travel accounts. They're seeing, things on the ground. And for them, this is confirming scripture, for example, right? It's like a very religiously motivated tour for many of these people. So they find sections in the Bible, for example, that they see as evidence of it having been worn also in biblical times. So disagreements about whether it's from then, maybe the 16th century, maybe it's timeless, they've always worn it, or maybe it's recent, maybe it's from the 19th century. So many different theories in these sources. And also who wore it, they couldn't decide on. Was it both Maronite and Druze women? Just Druze? Was it married women or all women, regardless of marital status? Was it just princesses? This is something repeated a lot in the Lebanese sources later. Was it nobility, the middle class? Was it absolutely everyone, right? So they can't get any of the basic details to match each other, right? Which means we should be very skeptical of these kinds of narratives. So I don't want to forget photography here because it's been an important part of how it's remembered in Lebanon. There's a lot of Orientalist photography from this period, from the late 19th century in particular. And this is something that you see a lot on social media, like when you pay attention to these things on Facebook, on Instagram, and you, for example, search for the Tantur, these photographs come up. Both of these photographs are from European photographers who settled in Beirut. So they had photography studios here locally, but they were not from here. And I want to kind of give a little warning when it comes to this kind of photography, because we have a tendency maybe to accept photography as proof, maybe more so than text, because there's this idea that whatever is behind the camera is something that existed in real life. And in a very basic sense, that's true. But these are staged photographs. So they're at studios. We know from the literature on Orientalist photography that often the models who sat for this kind of photography were not part of the group that they were supposedly representing. Women locally in the Ottoman Empire typically didn't pose for the camera unless it was like a family thing, right? If you take a picture with your family, it's a very different kind of statement. Here, these are not people depicted for their social identity. They're depicted as a symbol of a much larger community. It's not their name that's here, right? That they are Arab Druze of Mount Lebanon. This is the only caption, right? It doesn't have their social marker within their own society. And so in addition to it being staged, right, and typically these women being actually either local sex workers, that was a practice, and also like European wives of people who were here, who were willing, to sit for the photograph when local women were not. In addition, this is a particular genre of photography that you might call ethnographic photography or type photography, meaning that you are supposedly representing an entire group of people with the help of one single person. This forms part of European thinking about science and race. So eugenics comes out of this, where you can kind of classify every race in the world and then put them in a hierarchy, right? With European men being on top, as you can imagine. And so today we think of them as kind of pseudo-scientific race science, right? So a little bit of a warning there. I teach a whole class just on photography, like as a historical source, so I always have to bring it in somewhere. So this leads me to my second argument here tonight, which is that because there is so much material on the Tantur and other things, but especially the Tantur, written by Orientalist travelers, writers, and not people who are local to Mount Lebanon. This comes to define how Lebanese in the 20th century think about their own heritage and culture. So it's narrated not through local sources, but through Orientalist sources. This has implications for how people think about what is a folkloric costume, right? What did people look like in the past? When you have sources that are not from within the community, there tends to be kind of a poor understanding of local customs, right? But it's mediated through this. So this is not something that's unique to the Tantur. It forms part of a larger pattern in Lebanon and partly elsewhere, depending. For example, when it comes to the history writing of Lebanon, especially when it's not modern history, this partly comes out of a particular colonial tradition of archaeology. So, scholars of the Mandate here in Lebanon or Syria have argued before me that the kinds of digs, for example, that the French funded in Lebanon versus Syria were quite different in order to create a separate identity. So Islamic and Arab sites were sponsored in Syria, not in Lebanon, right? If they were Phoenician, Roman, etc., they would get funding. So Jbel or Byblos was a good example of that. They put quite a lot of money into that for very specific reasons, right? If Lebanon is not Arab or Islamic, then it can exist without Syria, right? Separate from Syria. This, though, continues. So this doesn't go away with independence. So this is from part of the work that I did for my dissertation. I looked through all of the titles of the National Museum of Beirut's academic review, the first 30 years. But if you note the years here, it's 1937 to 67, meaning most of these years are actually past independence, right? And so it might be intuitive, right, that during the French Mandate, during French colonialism, they're going to give money to stuff that helps their narrative of why they're in Lebanon, right? But it's maybe a little counterintuitive that that doesn't go away. So I counted. And when you look at the articles, the first 30 years, first of all, more than 2/3 were produced by French scholars, even after independence. About 10% were produced by other European, so non-French European scholars. There were a couple of Americans as well. And less than 5% of the articles were written by scholars from the region. Two in particular, one Lebanese, one Palestinian. The Lebanese scholar here is quite well known, Maurice Shahab. You might have heard of him. He was in charge of the museum, actually. We'll get back to him later, actually. But that also has implications for what kind of research is done. So if you look at the content of these articles, it's not just that the scholars are not local. If you look at the content here, in about 100 articles, it's a little bit less, there were only 3 articles that were on Arab or Islamic history when it came to Lebanon, meaning almost everything is about the opposite. So again, the Tantur here is not something that you can single out as unique. It's actually indicative of a much larger pattern of kind of historical knowledge production in Lebanon. And if you look at how Lebanese have talked about the Tantur, sometimes they very explicitly cite Orientalist literature as their main source. So here is one example from 1982 in Nahad. We have, because someone with a PhD wrote it, there is a citations list, thank you. You have the citations list, which is predominantly Orientalist travel writers. Often, though, what you see is that you see kind of echoes or quotes without necessarily having citations. Because there is so much variety in the Orientalist travel literature, there's also a lot of variety in the Lebanese literature. So I surveyed, thanks to UB, I put in Tantur in Arabic and French and read every single entry from the 1930s until today. And they're very, very varied, right? Because they're using very different sources, and so their conclusions about what the Tantur was used for, they vary a lot. But they echo these accounts pretty strikingly. So here is one example from L'Orient in 1947. So here they're talking about women getting ready for the day, right? Dressing up, etc. In Mount Lebanon in the early modern period. After they had finished taking care of themselves, they extended themselves indolently on their couches covered in silk, smoking argile or a pipe. So in a lot of Orientalist narratives about the Middle East, women are often portrayed exactly like this. Lying on couches, being lazy, being sexually available to kind of a European gaze. So echoing these narratives here. When it came to the Druze, they wore a veil on a very unusual ornament, the Tantur. The Tantur is a copper, silver, or gold horn, that part is true, and encrusted with precious stones. On the wedding day, the young bride put on her Tantur and never removed it again, not even on the night of her death. She did not remove it, but from time to time to clean it. The higher her social position, the taller the Tantur. So you'll note here that some of the tropes that I've already mentioned in the Orientalist literature is here as well, right? And this is something that is repeated throughout these sources that are written by Lebanese. This is not something that has left us. I did, as I mentioned, a little social media scan. This is from Facebook, from Lebanese Fashion History's profile, where they published a thing basically saying, this is the Tantur, you had to sleep with it, etc. And someone commented, this is very fun for me, someone commented, for what reason? Why would they do that, right? It's a pretty obvious question. Would you not, for example, wash your hair? Would you not want to remove it because it's uncomfortable, right? Would it not depend on the people you're around, right? Where the moderator here, or the person in charge of the account writes, ego. The Tantur was a sign of prestige and hierarchy. The crown doesn't come off. And also beauty is pain, right, which some of us can relate to. But if we think about this a little bit more deeply, right, when you display your socioeconomic status, when you display your wealth, would you need to display that at night? Who is going to see it, right? And so, again, we have the same kinds of questions coming out of the fact that the sources here are Orientalist travel literature. So I want to give you kind of a timeline of how this develops within the 20th century in Lebanese sources, so in newspapers in particular, but also outside of them. One of the really early mentions is in the 1930s. There are several accounts where high society Lebanese women wear them at like costume parties. Here's one example of that, which is, I guess, maybe from 1931, because they put a question mark after in the caption, but likely from the 30s. So here is a literal timeline. So from the sources that I've consulted, it comes up several times at these costume parties. It seems women of Lebanese high society had a kind of important role in popularizing it as a folkloric costume in the 30s and also after. 1939 is the first time I've seen it used to represent Lebanese culture to others. So at the New York's World Fair, at the Lebanese pavilion, there were like women wearing the Tantur as like symbolic of what it meant to look Lebanese, right? What it means to dress as a Lebanese person historically. There are articles in the 30s, in the 40s, in the 50s, both in the Arabic and French language newspapers, but it's really the 60s when it becomes a big topic, becomes part of kind of mainstream culture, and when it is cited, I mean, hundreds and hundreds of times for each year in the newspapers that I had to read through. It was fun. So first of all, it becomes part of how Lebanon is represented actually through beauty pageants. So you might have seen like Miss Lebanon before with the Tantur. This starts at least in 1960. This is the first recorded instance I found. But this happens very frequently after that, several times in the 60s. I have a few pictures I'll show you. In 1963, one particular figure enters who's very important in the kind of making of the mainstream headdress here, which is Idun Hauge. So you might know him. He's was pretty recently passed away. He produced theater plays here in Lebanon, folkloric ones in particular, and he popularizes it in the kind of realm of theater. So in Lebanese Nights, which is a segment of the Baalbek festival, in '63, it's first used as a theater costume there. He uses it in a lot of his plays, but this is the first instance. And this is the same year that the National Tourism Commission, which is one of there are actually a few kind of bureaucratic state agencies that deals with tourism, uses it abroad to market Lebanon as a tourist attraction. And 2 years after that, in 1965, Romeo Lahoud writes an entire play that's actually only about the Tantur. It's the main part of the plot. So it's talked about a lot in the Lebanese press that year. So Maurice Shahab is an important actor actually in this story. In the earlier articles, he is either cited, like they ask him questions about the Tantur, he writes about it. This is a slightly later, but this is an article that he wrote himself, published in 1962 about the Tantur. Or, for example, it doesn't mention him as an expert, but it'll have, for example, an illustration that he has provided of someone wearing a Tantur. So he's actually a very important figure here as like a thinker early on. It's funny, they ask him in the 60s, because I mean, as we saw, the kind of touristic Disneyfied version is like not particularly authentic. So one of the newspapers calls him up and asks him, you know, what do you think about this? It doesn't really look like the metal conical one. I mean, it kind of looks like, what's it called? Like the traffic cones, you know, like rather than the kind of narrow conical one, which is the historical one. And he says, oh yeah, it's not historically accurate at all. It's not authentic at all, but it has the spirit. That's great. It's funny. So he's often cited even later on. Then you have these beauty pageants. So this is the first photograph that I found of it in '65. So this is '65, '67, and '85. Frequently used to represent Lebanon abroad. So also kind of popularized through these beauty pageants, many of which were, you know, watched by Lebanese on television. And of course, as you can see, reported on in the media, right, as an authentic costume. The theater scene here is maybe what makes it the most famous. And this is both Romeo, but also his sister, Papou Lahoud. Here's a picture of both of them about 10 years ago when he presented her with an award. So he is the one who produces the theater, but she is the costume maker. She is the designer. So she's a well-known Lebanese designer. And we'll get back to her a little bit later. This is a picture of the play that has the Tantur as like the main part of the plot. It's about a Tantur that is missing its precious stones. He has to find them. And then the tourism industry is also a very important agent in making this visible for Lebanese people. This is both the public and the private part of the tourism industry. So the kind of government agencies promote this abroad. They have events. For example, they do like a culinary night in Europe in cooperation with Middle East Airlines, where you know, it's supposed to kind of have, you know, Lebanese food, and then people are supposed to go visit Lebanon, right? You know how it goes. But the welcoming staff, all of them wear Tantur. So it's all women, like the servers, and they wear the Tanturs, like the first ones that you encounter. So it's here part of kind of the visual repertoire. But in addition, the private industry also gets involved. So now the kind of what you might call like kitsch, you know, tourism souvenirs, now they also produce things on like a high scale when it comes to the Tantur. So there may have been, you know, things before that produced, but this is on a mass scale. Like now it's very very common to encounter. Here is a doll, for example, with the Tantur. Actually, a little bit more historically accurate though, so I'll give her that. The state also gets involved. Now there are Lebanese stamps that have the Tantur. This first one here is from 1964. This one, though, is in the context of the Baalbek festival because it's worn in '63, the year after. There's a collection of Baalbek festival stamps. This is only one of them. The second one here, though, doesn't have anything to do with the festival. It's part of a series of folkloric types of clothing, etc. So you see here there are 4 different ones where the Tantur with the oud is one of the stamps. So, you know, scholars of nationalism sometimes talk about stamps as like indicative of like a kind of state approach to nationalism, but in the realm of material culture. So another actor here that's important is Samia Saab, who kind of takes over in the 80s. So there's a lot of talk about the theater, etc., tourism, etc., in the 60s and 70s. In the 80s, of course, this is during Civil War. There's less talk about tourism for obvious reasons, right? There are fewer tourists and there are fewer plays also, although there are actually plays, for example, at the Casino du Liban. But this is when Saab emerges, and she writes extensively, actually, in Lebanese newspapers. She's kind of like a costume consultant, if that's a word. She writes about it. She has photographic exhibits. She does like fashion shows, kind of, but with folkloric costumes. It's not only the Tantur, but the Tantur is a major part of this. Also, when she dresses up for these events, she tends to wear it herself. So it's very important to her, and she writes about it a lot. Her accounts also vary very considerably. So depending on what year you're reading her, she says very different things. You know, again, not because she's, you know, not citing her sources properly. She is, but the sources vary so much, right? That her own accounts also vary a lot. So with the popularization of the Tantur as a symbol of the Lebanese nation, here comes my third and final argument of today's lecture, which is that the Tantur is indicative of a much larger pattern within Lebanese nationalism that centers Christians, in particular the Maronite community, by favoring the culture, history, heritage of Mount Lebanon in particular, excluding the rest of Lebanon, the coast, for example, the cities, in a way that also excludes Lebanon's Sunni and Shia population. So I'll get back to what I mean by that. But the people I've just talked about, they were sometimes confronted with this question: why are you only focusing on Mount Lebanon, right? Obviously, there are more parts of this country. And Samia Saab, for example, in an interview with L'Orient Le Jour, talked at length about how Mount Lebanon was kind of the true soul of Lebanon, not other regions. This is what she said at the time. Our folklore is actually synonymous with the customs of Mount Lebanon. Thus, the two mountain communities, meaning the Druze and the Maronites, were united in their work and their life while preserving their cultures and religious customs. It is from this mountain that the Lebanese costume was born, right? The costume is her, you know, primary area here. So the interviewer actually doesn't leave it at that. He asks her, presumably there are costumes from other parts of Lebanon, right? Why only Mount Lebanon, right? And this is what she has to say as a response. She says, along the coast, Muslims and Catholics, note here how the two communities here are clearly excluding other Christian communities. Muslims and Catholics were settled, but the Lebanese emirate that ruled in the mountain was the promoter of habits and costumes and also of fashion. All Lebanese copied the clothing that the mountain started. So she is actually rhetorically here including what she calls Muslims and Catholics into who is Lebanese, right? She's not saying that they're not Lebanese. What she's saying is that influence only went from Mount Lebanon to the rest of Lebanon, and that there is no influence from other parts of the country. If you were a scholar, right, you could not write this. You would need a lot of evidence to back this up. But even if, and you know, this is not my field, right? I do 20th century Lebanese history. 19th, 18th, 17th, 16th century Lebanese fashion is not my area of expertise, right? It's the modern period. And so I can't tell you, right, where fashion was coming from. That's a very different project than what I'm doing. But if we think about it just for a second, right, the idea that the coast had no influence whatsoever on Mount Lebanon, for example, when the coast has the big cities, seems a little bit unlikely, right? For example, there are very close ties between, for example, a place like Tripoli and Damascus, right? Did Tripoli not have any sartorial clothing influences from Damascus, only from Mount Lebanon, right? This is highly unlikely, right? And so we see often that they kind of dodge the questions a little bit. So another person who was presented with this question was Idun Hauge, the costume designer, by me. I did an interview with her. She was very kind. She sat down with me and answered all my probing questions. And I asked her, you know, you're making these folkloric costumes. How did you know how to make them? Right? How do you know what's Lebanese historically? How do you know what the pants should look like? How do you know about the colors, etc.? So first of all, she said that her brother, Idun Hauge, showed her Orientalist visual culture. So she said she looked at engravings by certain Western travelers and that this is how she recreated. So again, going back to my second point here, which is that a lot of this comes out of a very particular body of knowledge, right? But I also asked her, you know, what are the sources of Lebanese culture? So she described it as being Phoenicians in particular, Canaanites. When it came to clothing, she also included the Ottomans, right, which of course is true, right? It's part of the Ottoman Empire for a long time. But she opposes this with, she juxtaposes this with Arab tribes and what she calls their invasions, right? This is something that you hear in Lebanon from time to time, right? The implication here is that this is somehow separate from Lebanese identity, right? That it's a hostile invasion, right? And that they are not part of what it means to be Lebanese. And she doesn't see this as part of anything that influenced folklore. On the Ottomans, she says, we, the Lebanese, had lighter clothes and less embroidery, reflecting our way of life. And I like that. Even in our architecture, it's the same. It's simple, much simpler, and especially the Christian houses, or even Druze houses. But the Muslim houses, they have more colors. So note the language that she's using here. First, she's saying Mount Lebanon has like simpler decoration, like simpler construction of houses. You might have seen that, right? If you go to like Keserwan, for example, the houses, the old houses, right? They're not very ornamental, right? I was in Istanbul, gloriously, a few weeks ago, and some of the decoration, of course, is very impressive, very lavish, right? So she's saying here it's simpler, right? But also note how the main community to her is Christian. So it's Christian houses, maybe also Druze, but definitely not Muslim, right? She says it's the same for dress, costume, and other things. So sometimes when they're kind of posed these questions, they kind of try to avoid a little bit, or they just say, but this is what's different about Lebanon. If you choose something from Tripoli, it's going to be the same as Syria, so why would you choose that, right? So I want to tackle that question head on, right? Why not only focus on Mount Lebanon? What's the problem, right, with only focusing on Mount Lebanon when Mount Lebanon in some ways is different from other places, right? The architecture is simpler, right? I mean, I'm sure you've all seen some of the architecture, right? It is a little bit simpler. Why is it not natural or inevitable to choose that as a kind of a national culture? So I want to take a step back a little bit. Historians who talk about nationalism, theorists of nationalism, right? They don't have to be historians. They can be political scientists, for example. They have a lot to say about nationalism, and they disagree on a lot of stuff, right? But there are a couple of things that they agree on. One of them being that nationalism is constructed. The other one being that nationalism or nationalist narratives are ahistorical. So what do I mean by that? A nationalist narrative projects an existing community in the present back into the past in ways that are not accurate historically. It doesn't matter which one you choose. You can have my own, I'm Norwegian. It is not going to be historically accurate. You can do Lebanese, project it into the past, it's not going to be historically accurate, right? And if you think about it, it makes sense. So, for example, a group of people can never stay the same over time, right? In a place like Lebanon, but also virtually anywhere in the world, there's always migration, right? You have people coming in, famously in Lebanon, also plenty of people going out, right? The Lebanese diaspora is very large. And so even the people physically here is going to change over time. There's intermarriage, there's conversion, right, in Mount Lebanon, famously. And so that is going to change. Even if you say, this person is, let's say, Maronite Christian today, this person is Maronite Christian in the year of 1700. What it means to be a member of that community changes over time, right? What it means to say, this is what it means for me to be Norwegian today, is going to look different 100 years ago, right? So the meanings change over time and the populations change over time. Additionally, as scientists reminds us, there's no such thing as race biologically, right? Race is a human social construct, right? That we think of race as something maybe you can test. At least these, like, I don't know if you know about, what's it called? 24andMe? 23andMe? Which one, what number is it? I don't know. And,
Don't worry.
Oh, I'm not worrying. Can I continue or do I stop for them? Yeah. So, the kinds of tests that they do, like the ones that you pay for to like find out where you're from if you're American, this is what we would call pseudoscience, right? If you have questions about that, very happy to elaborate after the lecture. But all that to say, there's no single community that survives throughout time. They necessarily change over time. In addition to that, the past is very complicated, right? The past is very complex. And so when you make a narrative that supposedly tracks a history of someone over time, you are choosing certain things over other things, right? It's not inevitable what you choose, and it's not somehow a given. So So when this happens, the people online, do we still have Wi-Fi? Can they hear it still? Oh, okay. Oh, so it doesn't matter. Yeah, it's like, oh, they're gonna miss me talking badly about the DNA test that they charged $40 for in the US. How sad for them. Okay. All right. So the choices that you make are not neutral. They're typically ideologically significant. So who you focus on, when you start the story, where you focus on, has political meaning in any country, right? In any type of nationalism. Sometimes also nationalism tends to naturalize existing power structures. If it's a nationalism that is well established, it tends to paint the dominant group as naturally the dominant group, right? If you're an aspiring nationalist group that doesn't have a nation state, that tends to look a little bit different, right? But keeping that in mind, reviewing kind of the role of the Tantur here in Lebanese nationalism, I think is indicative of this larger trend. So if you think about Lebanese nationalism, the kind that is promoted by the tourism industry in this period, for example, that starts the clock with Phoenicians, right, who for sure did not think of themselves as Lebanese, right? Also, they were not just in parts of Lebanon. They were not all over Lebanon also. Starting it there is not politically neutral, right? This has been covered by other scholars than me. The idea, for example, that Lebanon is a refuge, right, for minorities, by definition excludes the Sunni population, for example. The idea that Arab or Islamic sites, Anjad, for example, is not a main part of the national culture or history, is also not neutral ideologically, right? And so the Tantur here and the focus on Mount Lebanon needs to be placed into this particular context, right? And again, this is not at all unique to Lebanese nationalism. I mean, virtually all nationalisms do this. Not all of them necessarily exclude people on the inside of the borders. Many do, though. With indigenous peoples, for example, there are all kinds of examples of that. Typically, the major other is an external party, like a neighbor, for example. we do that a little bit, but not with the Finns, don't worry. It's the Danes and the Swedes. Of course, when we're abroad, we're all together at all times and think of ourselves as the same. So it's a little bit flexible. And so the Tantur here forms part of this larger focus. And I want to come back to this idea that it's particularly a Druze headwear because, of course it was shared in Mount Lebanon originally. It is true that probably Druze women wore it longer, right? Because it was banned by the Maronite Church in the 1840s, became more associated with the Druze. Orientalist travelers wrote about it as being a Druze thing, most of them, right? And so it is kind of, it shouldn't be too surprising that it's considered a Druze headwear. But at the same time, I think the timing here is indicative of a kind of larger story. Because imagine if this narrative was in the mid-19th century, right? There is sectarian violence between the Maronite and Druze communities in the 40s and the 60s. The idea that a Druze headgear would somehow represent Lebanese culture at that time, right, would not have made a lot of sense if it's a pro-Christian narrative, right? The timing here is key. So when the Druze community emerge as a symbol of Lebanese nationalism is precisely when they are politically marginalized. So with the creation of Greater Lebanon, right, Grand Liban, you have now a Druze population that used to be politically important, right? In Mount Lebanon, they were politically significant, but now it's at about 5 to 7% of the population, right? Meaning they're not particularly politically potent as a force, right? And so this precisely is when in narratives that depict the French mandate as good, depict the Lebanese nation with the existing power structure dominated by Maronites at this point, right, until the Civil War, as natural, right, bring in the Druze figure as a kind of intersectarian figure, right, saying it's not just Christian culture, right, it's not just Maronite culture. Mount Lebanon is shared between Druze and Maronites, so it's not necessarily exclusionary, right? So I think, in the kind of story of when this happens, looking at the power structures at the time is very, very important. So I am not even Lebanese, right? Even if I were, right? It's not my place to say, what should Lebanese nationalism look like, right? As scholars, also, that's not our business, right? Also, it doesn't matter how you paint Lebanese history. It's always going to be historically inaccurate if you portray it as like a timeless nation, right? So in that sense, it doesn't matter. But what I hope I have done a little bit today, and by hopefully kind of distributing some of the research that I do and that others do, what I hope to do is to kind of democratize how these processes first came about, right? Not because I'm deciding anything, but because I think it doesn't mean that something needs to be changed necessarily, right? But having an awareness of how these historical narratives evolve over time, I think makes it a little bit easier also to not think that certain outcomes are inevitable, right? That they are often surprising at the time when it happens, that we can't really predict the future, and people in the past also couldn't predict the future, right? And so hopefully that's what I've done today. So I look forward to questions, but those I'm going to take sitting and have a little bit of water. Thank you.